"Hand my dad the keys, Emily," Daniel said. And in that single sentence, the woman who had spent 10 years building a life with him felt like she no longer recognized the man standing in front of her. The room was silent except for the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the Whitmore family estate. Emily Carter stood beside the dining table, her fingers resting on the edge of the chair she had carefully chosen years ago when this house was still just a dream on a piece of paper. Across from her, her husband Daniel Whitmore looked calm, almost distant, while his father Richard watched with a satisfied expression that made Emily's heart sink. The keys were sitting on the polished wood between them. The keys to the house. The keys to the car. The keys to the life Emily had helped create. "Daniel, what are you saying?" Emily asked softly. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was searching his face for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, some hint that he was about to smile and tell her this was all a mistake. But Daniel only looked away for a moment before answering. "My dad will handle things from now on. It's better for everyone. Better for everyone." Those words hurt more than the request itself, because Emily knew what those words meant. For years, she had been the person standing beside Daniel when no one else believed in him. She remembered the tiny apartment they lived in when they were first married, the one-bedroom place with the old heater that barely worked during the winter. She remembered Daniel coming home late at night after another failed business meeting, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, wondering if he would ever succeed. She had been there. She had encouraged him. She had believed in him before the world knew his name. But now, standing in the home they built together, she felt like a stranger being asked to hand over the last piece of herself. Richard stepped forward and reached for the keys. "This is the right decision, Emily. Daniel needs someone experienced managing his future." Emily looked at him carefully. She had always known Richard never truly accepted her. To him, she was the woman who married his son before Daniel became successful. He never saw the nights she spent working extra hours. He never saw the sacrifices she made quietly without asking for recognition. Daniel finally looked at her. "Emily, please don't make this difficult." She almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Difficult. That was what he called the moment when his wife was being asked to surrender everything without explanation. She took a slow breath and looked down at the keys. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled. It was not a smile of happiness. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they have finally stopped fighting to be understood. "Okay," she said quietly. Daniel seemed surprised by how easily she agreed. He had expected an argument, tears, maybe anger. Instead, Emily picked up the keys and placed them into Richard's hand. "If this is what you truly want, I won't stop you." Richard smiled, believing he had won. Daniel relaxed, believing the problem was over. But neither of them noticed the small envelope Emily placed beside the keys before she stepped away. An envelope she had carried for years. An envelope containing a truth that would change everything they thought they knew about their family, their success, and the woman they had underestimated. For 10 years, Emily Carter had been the quiet force behind Daniel Whitmore's success, but almost no one knew the story of the woman who stood beside him before the world ever learned his name. Long before the expensive suits, the glass office buildings, and the headlines celebrating Daniel as one of the youngest rising entrepreneurs in the city, there was a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood where two young people were trying to build a future with very little money and a lot of hope. Emily still remembered those early mornings when Daniel would sit at their tiny kitchen table with a notebook full of ideas and a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He would talk about his dreams, about creating something meaningful, about proving that he was more than the expectations placed on him by his family. And Emily always listened. She believed in him when even he struggled to believe in himself. When Daniel's first business idea failed, Emily was the one who reminded him that failure was not the end. When bills became difficult, she quietly picked up extra work and never complained. When Daniel felt embarrassed about not being able to provide the life he wanted, she held his hand and told him that they were a team. She never measured their marriage by what they owned. She measured it by the promises they made to each other. Years passed, and everything changed. Daniel's company finally succeeded. The same people who once ignored him began inviting him to exclusive events. His family, who had questioned his choices, suddenly started celebrating his achievements. The small apartment was replaced by a beautiful home in an elegant neighborhood. The old car was replaced by luxury vehicles parked in the driveway. But somewhere along the way, Emily noticed something changing. It was not the money. It was not the success. It was the distance. Daniel became busier. Family meetings became more important than quiet dinners together. Decisions that they once made as a couple started being discussed without her. At first, Emily told herself it was normal. Success came with responsibilities. But deep down, she felt like she was slowly disappearing from a life she had helped create. The moment she realized how far things had changed was during a family dinner several months earlier. Richard Whitmore had spent the evening talking about legacy, reputation, and the future of the Whitmore name. He spoke as if Daniel's success belonged only to the family that carried the last name. Emily sat quietly, watching Daniel listen. She waited for him to mention the years they spent struggling together. She waited for him to remind his father that success did not happen overnight. But Daniel said nothing. That silence stayed with her. After that night, Emily began keeping records. Not because she wanted revenge. Not because she wanted to prove anyone wrong. She simply wanted to protect the truth. She saved old documents, letters, financial records, and memories from the years when Daniel had nothing but ambition. She kept everything organized in a small envelope hidden in her desk drawer. It was not a weapon. It was a reminder of a chapter everyone seemed to have forgotten. The day Daniel asked her to hand over the keys, she already understood something important. She could argue. She could fight. She could demand recognition. But she knew something Daniel had forgotten. Real strength was not always found in raising your voice. Sometimes it was found in knowing when to step back and let people reveal who they truly were. As Emily walked away from the Whitmore estate that afternoon, she carried nothing except a small handbag and the quiet confidence that she had stayed true to herself. Behind her, Daniel and Richard believed they had taken control of the situation. They believed Emily had finally accepted her place. But they did not know that the woman they underestimated had spent years protecting the very future they were trying to claim. And soon, they would discover that the biggest mistake they made was believing Emily Carter had nothing left to say. The morning after Emily left the Whitmore estate, Daniel woke up expecting everything to feel normal. He expected the familiar quiet of the house, the comfort of his routine, and the certainty that the difficult conversation from the previous day would eventually become nothing more than a forgotten disagreement. But as he walked through the spacious rooms, something felt different. The house was still the same. The furniture was still perfectly arranged. The view from the windows was still the same beautiful city skyline. Yet for the first time in years, Daniel noticed how empty everything felt without Emily there. He told himself she was simply upset. He believed she would come back after having time to think. After all, she had always been the one who stayed. She had always been the one who understood him. That was what made him overlook something important. He had started believing Emily would never leave. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore was already moving forward with his plans. Sitting in Daniel's office, he reviewed documents and spoke confidently about the future. He talked about expanding the company, protecting the family name, and making sure the Whitmore legacy remained in the right hands. Daniel listened, but something about the conversation felt uncomfortable. For years, he had admired his father's confidence. He had wanted Richard's approval more than he wanted to admit. But now, after Emily's quiet departure, he started noticing things he had ignored before. Richard never asked how Emily was doing. He never questioned whether Daniel had hurt the person who stood beside him for a decade. The only thing that mattered was control. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned to the office and found one of his longtime employees waiting for him. Her name was Grace Mitchell, the company's financial manager who had worked there since the earliest days. She had seen the company grow from a small operation into a successful business. Daniel, there is something you should know, Grace said carefully. Daniel looked confused. He expected another business update, another report, another problem that needed solving. Instead, Grace placed an old folder on his desk. Inside were copies of financial records from years ago, records from the time when the company was struggling. Daniel looked through the papers and immediately recognized the dates. His expression changed. "Where did you get these?" he asked. Grace looked at him seriously. "Emily asked me to keep them safe years ago." Daniel froze. He had expected many things from Emily. He had expected disappointment. He had expected anger. But he had never expected that she had been protecting his history all along. Grace explained that during the hardest years of the company, Emily had quietly helped keep everything together. She had made sacrifices that Daniel never knew about because she did not want him to feel like his achievements were not truly his own. She wanted him to believe he was capable. She wanted him to succeed because she loved him, not because she wanted credit. Daniel sat silently, looking at the documents in front of him. For the first time, he began questioning the story he had accepted for years. He had listened to people who told him Emily was not involved enough. He had believed the idea that success belonged only to those who stood in the spotlight. But the truth was much more complicated. The person who had been standing quietly behind him had been carrying more responsibility than anyone realized. That evening, Daniel returned home and walked into the room where Emily had kept her desk. The drawer was empty. The space where she once organized their family memories, bills, and old photographs was now completely cleared. It was a small detail, but it affected him more than he expected. Emily had not taken anything valuable. She had not tried to hurt him. She had simply removed herself from a place where she no longer felt seen. Daniel finally understood the meaning behind her calm expression the day she handed over the keys. She was not giving up. She was letting him see what life looked like without the person who had always been there. And for the first time, Daniel wondered if the greatest thing he had lost was never the house, the company, or the success. It was the trust of the one person who had believed in him before anyone else did. The days after Emily Carter left the Whitmore estate became a quiet battle between memory and reality for Daniel. Every corner of the house reminded him of moments he had overlooked. The kitchen where Emily used to prepare dinner after long days. The small reading room where she organized their old photographs. The garden where they once planned the future they wanted to build together. For years, Daniel had believed these things existed because of his success. Now he was beginning to understand that they existed because Emily had poured her heart into creating a home, not just a beautiful place to live. While Daniel struggled with these realizations, Richard Whitmore continued moving forward as if nothing had changed. He scheduled meetings, reviewed company plans, and spoke about the future with complete confidence. He believed Emily was finally out of the way. To Richard, she had always been a person standing between the Whitmore family and complete control. But there was one thing Richard did not know. Emily had spent years protecting information that could change how everyone viewed the company. After leaving the estate, Emily stayed with her younger sister Sophia Carter in a quiet neighborhood outside the city. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to slow down. She woke up without checking Daniel's schedule. She ate breakfast without rushing to prepare for someone else's day. She walked through the neighborhood and remembered what it felt like to make decisions for herself. Sophia watched her carefully. She knew Emily was strong, but she also knew strength did not mean someone never felt hurt. "You gave him everything," Sophia said one evening while they sat together with cups of coffee on the porch. Emily looked at the streetlights glowing in the distance. "I gave him what I chose to give. That does not mean I lost myself." Sophia smiled because that was the Emily she remembered. The woman who could be kind without being weak. The woman who could love deeply without forgetting her own worth. Meanwhile, Daniel began looking deeper into the company records. The documents Grace had shown him raised questions he could no longer ignore. He He reviewed old agreements, early investments, and financial decisions from the beginning of his career. The more he learned, the more he realized that the story he had been told was incomplete. Richard had always described Emily as someone who simply supported him emotionally. But the records showed something different. Emily had contributed ideas, connections, and resources at critical moments when the company was close to failing. She had never demanded recognition because she believed Daniel needed confidence more than he needed to know every sacrifice she made. That discovery changed something inside Daniel. He began remembering conversations he had forgotten. He remembered Emily sitting beside him late at night, encouraging him when he wanted to give up. He remembered her telling him that success was not about proving others wrong. It was about creating something meaningful. And now he understood the painful truth. He had spent years chasing approval from people who were not there during his hardest moments, while ignoring the person who had always been there. When Daniel confronted Richard about the records, his father remained calm. He explained everything away as normal business decisions. He said Emily was only helping because she was his wife. He said Daniel was the one who built the company. But for the first time, Daniel did not accept the answer. He looked at his father and realized that protecting the Whitmore name had become more important than protecting the people who truly cared about him. That night, Daniel returned to the office alone. He sat at his desk surrounded by awards, achievements, and reminders of success. Yet none of them gave him the comfort he expected. Because for the first time, Daniel understood that a person could have everything the world admired and still lose the one thing that mattered most. The next morning, he made a decision. He would stop trying to prove that he was right. He would start searching for the truth, no matter how difficult it was to accept. Because somewhere along the way, he had forgotten the person who believed in him before anyone else ever did. Daniel Whitmore spent the next several days searching for answers that he had avoided for years. Every document he reviewed revealed another piece of a story he never understood. The more he learned, the harder it became to accept the reality in front of him. Emily had never been the person standing behind his success. She had been one of the reasons his success existed at all. Yet she had never asked for praise. She had never reminded him of what she had done. She simply believed that if Daniel achieved his dream, then their shared dream had come true. But now Daniel had to face the truth that he had allowed other people to rewrite their story. One person in particular had shaped the way he saw Emily. His father. Richard Whitmore had always been a powerful figure in Daniel's life. From childhood, Daniel had learned to value achievement, reputation, and family image above everything else. Richard believed that emotions could distract people from success. He believed difficult decisions required sacrifice. For years, Daniel thought that mindset made his father strong. Now he wondered if it had only made him overlook the people who mattered most. When Daniel arrived at the company headquarters that morning, he asked Grace Mitchell to meet him privately. The office was quiet, with employees moving through the halls unaware of the questions filling Daniel's mind. "I need to know everything," Daniel said. Grace looked at him for a moment before opening another folder. Inside were notes, records, and old correspondence from the early years of the company. "Emily asked me never to show these unless the truth was being forgotten," Grace explained. Daniel looked through the pages carefully. There were moments when the company had almost lost everything. There were opportunities that appeared because Emily had built relationships and offered solutions. There were difficult periods when she had personally helped keep things stable. None of it had been done publicly. None of it had carried her name. Daniel felt a heavy sense of regret. He remembered how many times he had introduced Emily as someone who supported him. He realized now that his words had never fully described what she had actually done. She was not simply supporting his journey. She was walking beside him through every difficult step. That afternoon, Daniel visited the old apartment building where they had lived when they first married. He did not know why he went there. Maybe he wanted to find a connection to the person he used to be. Maybe he wanted to remember the version of himself who still appreciated every small thing he had. He stood outside the building and remembered Emily sitting beside him on the front steps after a long day. They had no luxury. They had no impressive achievements. But they had each other, and at the time, Daniel believed that was enough. As he returned to his car, he received a message from Richard asking him to attend an important family meeting. Daniel knew what that meant. His father wanted to finalize the changes he had been planning. For years, Daniel would have agreed without question. But this time was different. He entered the meeting room and saw Richard sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by documents and confident expressions. Richard immediately began discussing the future of the family business. He spoke about protecting assets, maintaining control, and making sure decisions stayed within the Whitmore family. Daniel listened quietly until his father finished. Then he asked one simple question. "Why did you never tell me what Emily did for this company?" The room became silent. Richard looked surprised for only a moment before returning to his usual calm expression. He explained that Emily's contributions were exaggerated. He said Daniel was the true reason the company succeeded. But Daniel no longer saw the situation the same way. He understood that success was never created by one person alone. It was built by every person who offered support, trust, and commitment along the way. Daniel left the meeting without giving Richard the answer he wanted. For the first time in his life, he chose to question the expectations placed on him. Later that evening, he looked at the empty space beside him at home and realized something painful. Emily had not walked away because she stopped caring. She walked away because she had spent too long caring about someone who stopped seeing her. And now Daniel had to decide whether he was willing to become the person she once believed he could be. Daniel knew that finding the truth was only the beginning. Understanding what happened was easier than accepting what he had done. For years, he had allowed himself to believe that success gave him the right to make decisions without looking back. He had convinced himself that Emily would always understand because she had always been patient. But now he realized patience was not the same as endless forgiveness. Emily had given him years of loyalty, and he had mistaken that loyalty for something permanent that he never had to protect. The first thing Daniel did was return to the Whitmore estate. Not because he expected Emily to be there. He already knew she was not coming back simply because he asked. He went because he needed to see the place differently. When he walked through the front door, he no longer saw a symbol of achievement. He saw the small details he had ignored. The family photos Emily carefully arranged. The decorations she changed every season. The books she placed on shelves because she knew he liked reading them. Every detail carried a memory of her effort. He stopped. In the hallway where they had once celebrated their first major success. Daniel remembered that night clearly. He had been excited about the future and believed everything was finally falling into place. Emily had smiled and told him she was proud of him. At the time, he thought she was proud because he had succeeded. Now he understood she was proud because she knew how hard he had worked. There was a difference, and he had failed to see it. Meanwhile, Emily continued rebuilding her own life. She returned to simple routines that made her feel like herself again. She started spending time with Sophia, reconnecting with old friends, and focusing on things she had placed aside while supporting Daniel. She did not tell people the full story. She did not try to make Daniel look like the villain. When someone asked what happened, she simply said that sometimes people grow apart and need time to understand what truly matters. Sophia admired that about her. Emily was hurt, but she refused to let pain turn into bitterness. One afternoon, Daniel finally found the courage to call her. The phone rang several times before Emily answered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There were too many things between them that could not be explained in a single conversation. "Emily," Daniel said quietly, "I owe you an apology." She listened, but did not interrupt. Daniel continued. He admitted that he had allowed his family's opinions to influence him. He admitted that he had stopped seeing her as his partner and started treating her like someone who would always support him no matter what. Most importantly, he admitted that he was wrong. Emily closed her eyes as she listened. Part of her wanted to believe those words immediately, Another part of her remembered all the moments when she had waited for him to notice what was happening. Daniel, she finally said, an apology matters, but trust is not rebuilt with words alone. Her voice was calm, not angry. That made the truth even harder for him to accept. She was not trying to punish him. She was simply protecting the part of herself she had neglected for years. Daniel understood. He knew he could not ask her to return to the same life that had caused her pain. He needed to prove that things could be different. The next day, Daniel made a decision that surprised everyone at the company. He called a meeting with the executive team and reviewed the changes his father had been planning. Instead of moving forward with Richard's ideas without question, Daniel asked for a complete review of the company's history and decisions. He wanted transparency. He wanted accountability. He wanted the truth to be recognized, even if it meant admitting mistakes. When Richard heard about the meeting, he was disappointed. He believed Daniel was allowing emotions to interfere with business. But Daniel no longer saw honesty as weakness. He had spent years trying to become the kind of person his father respected. Now he wanted to become the kind of person Emily had believed he could be. That evening, Daniel opened the drawer where Emily had kept their old memories. Inside, he found a photograph from their early years together. They were standing outside their first apartment, smiling despite having very little. Daniel looked at that picture for a long time. He finally understood something he should have known all along. Emily was never impressed by what he owned. She loved who he was before he had anything to prove. And if he wanted another chance, he would have to become that person again. Daniel spent the following week learning what it meant to rebuild something he had almost lost. For the first time in years, he stopped searching for quick solutions and started paying attention to the damage caused by his own choices. He had spent most of his life believing that problems could be solved with determination, money, or a well-planned strategy. But his relationship with Emily was not a business challenge. It was not something he could fix with a contract or a promise. It required patience, honesty, and the willingness to accept that he had been wrong. At the company, Daniel made changes that surprised everyone. He asked Grace Mitchell to organize a complete review of the early years of the business. He wanted every contribution recognized, including the ones that had never been publicly mentioned. Some executives questioned why he was reopening old records, but Daniel remained clear. He explained that a company could not build a strong future by ignoring the people who helped create its foundation. Richard Whitmore was not pleased. He believed Daniel was making unnecessary changes because of personal feelings. During a private conversation, Richard told his son that successful people had to make difficult choices and leave emotions behind. Daniel listened quietly, but this time he did not accept those words without question. "Dad, there is a difference between making difficult choices and forgetting the people who stood beside you," Daniel replied. It was the first time Daniel had openly challenged his father's perspective. Richard looked surprised because he was seeing a different version of his son. The Daniel who once searched for approval was slowly becoming someone who could think for himself. Meanwhile, Emily was building a new routine. She had started working on a small community project that combined her love of organization and helping others. It was not something that brought public attention or financial rewards. She simply enjoyed feeling useful in a way that belonged to her. Sophia noticed the change in her sister. Emily seemed calmer. She smiled more often. She was rediscovering parts of herself that had been quiet for years. One evening, Daniel visited Sophia's home. He did not arrive with expensive gifts or dramatic promises. He came with a simple request to speak with Emily. When Emily agreed, they sat across from each other in the quiet living room. Daniel looked different, not because his appearance had changed, but because his confidence had softened. "I know I cannot undo what happened," Daniel said. "I know I cannot ask you to forget how alone you felt." Emily listened carefully. She appreciated that he was finally acknowledging her feelings instead of explaining them away. Daniel continued, "I spent years thinking I needed to prove myself to everyone else. But the person who believed in me before I had anything was the person I stopped listening to. Emily looked down for a moment. Those words were meaningful, but she also knew that understanding came after a long period of being ignored. Daniel, I love the person you were when we had nothing, she said. The person who appreciated every little thing. The person who saw us as a team. I do not know if that person is still there. Daniel nodded because he knew she was right. He could not demand another chance. He could only show that he deserved one. Before leaving, Daniel placed a small box on the table. Inside was a collection of old photographs from their first years together. He had restored them from damaged copies he found in storage. I found these while looking through our old things, he explained. I realized I had forgotten how happy we were before I started chasing everyone else's approval. Emily looked at the photographs quietly. She remembered those moments. They were not perfect moments. They were simple moments. But they were real. After Daniel left, Emily sat alone with the photographs for a long time. She knew forgiveness would not happen overnight. She knew trust needed time. But for the first time since everything changed, she felt that Daniel was finally seeing the truth. Not just the truth about the company. Not just the truth about the past. The truth about her. The weeks that followed were different from anything Daniel and Emily had experienced before. There was no sudden return to the way things used to be. There was no single conversation that erased months of disappointment. Instead, there were small moments. Quiet moments. Moments where trust slowly began to rebuild through actions rather than promises. Daniel understood that the hardest part was not convincing Emily that he had changed. The hardest part was proving it without expecting anything in return. He started by changing the way he lived his daily life. He stopped allowing his schedule to control every decision. He made time to listen. He asked questions and waited for the answers instead of immediately explaining his own thoughts. For years, Daniel had been focused on being successful, but now he was learning how to be present. At the company, Daniel continued making changes. He created a new system that recognized contributions from every person who helped the business grow. When employees who had worked quietly behind the scenes received appreciation, many of them were surprised. They had become used to their efforts being overlooked. Daniel realized that the culture he had accepted was the same one that had made Emily feel invisible. He wanted to change that. Richard noticed the difference. One afternoon, he visited Daniel's office and looked around at the changes being made. He was disappointed that his son no longer followed every suggestion without question. You are letting personal feelings influence your decisions, Richard said. Daniel looked at him calmly. No, I am finally understanding that people are part of every decision. Richard did not respond immediately. For years, he had believed success came from control. But Daniel was beginning to believe success came from trust. Their relationship remained complicated, but Daniel no longer feared disagreeing with his father. He was no longer trying to earn approval from someone who could never give him what he truly wanted. Meanwhile, Emily continued focusing on herself. She appreciated the changes she saw in Daniel, but she also learned to value her own independence. She spent more time with Sophia, explored new interests, and began planning a future that was not built around someone else's goals. When Daniel invited her to dinner one evening, she agreed. Not because she had forgotten everything. Not because she was ready to pretend nothing happened. She agreed because she wanted to understand who Daniel was becoming. They met at a small restaurant they used to visit when they were younger. It was not expensive or impressive. It was simply a place filled with memories. Daniel smiled when he noticed Emily looking around. I remember when we used to come here after long days, he said. Emily nodded. We did not have much back then. Daniel smiled softly. But we were happy. That sentence stayed between them for a moment. Because they both knew the truth. Their happiest moments were never about what they owned. They were about how they treated each other. Daniel apologized again. But this time he did not focus on defending himself. He spoke about what he had learned. He admitted that he had confused success with importance. He admitted that he had allowed other people's opinions to become louder than the voice of the person who loved him most. Emily listened carefully. She could see the difference. The old Daniel would have searched for a way to explain why things happened. This Daniel was finally accepting responsibility. I do not need you to promise that everything will be perfect, Emily said. I need to know that I will not disappear again. Daniel nodded. You will never have to fight to be seen by me again. It was not a dramatic promise. It was a simple commitment. And for the first time in a long time, Emily believed that maybe their story was not ending. Maybe it was becoming something new. Later that night, Daniel returned home and looked at the photograph from their early years together. He realized that rebuilding their relationship was not about returning to the past. They could not become the same two people they were before. Too much had happened. Instead, they had the opportunity to create something stronger. Something built on honesty, respect, and understanding. And for the first time since everything changed, Daniel and Emily were no longer trying to prove who was right. They were finally learning how to find their way back to each other. 1 year later, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like the same place. The walls, the furniture, and the view of the city were still there, but the feeling inside the home had completely changed. It was no longer a place where decisions were made without discussion. It was no longer a place where one person carried the weight while everyone else enjoyed the results. It had become a home built on respect, understanding, and the simple moments that had once been forgotten. Emily Carter stood by the kitchen window one quiet morning, holding a cup of coffee while watching the sunlight spread across the garden. She thought about how much had changed. A year earlier, she had walked away believing she had lost everything. Now she understood that leaving had been the moment she finally found herself again. Daniel entered the room and smiled when he saw her. It was a small smile, the kind that reminded her of the man she first met years ago. Not the successful executive everyone admired. Not the person always trying to prove something. Just Daniel, the man who once dreamed about building a meaningful life with her. You are thinking about the past again, Daniel said gently. Emily smiled. I am thinking about how different things are now. Daniel looked around the room. I am too. Their relationship had not been repaired by one apology or one perfect moment. It had been rebuilt through hundreds of small choices. Daniel learned to listen before responding. He learned that being a partner meant sharing responsibility, not simply making decisions and expecting support. Emily learned that loving someone did not mean losing herself. She could care deeply while still protecting her own dreams and happiness. The company had changed as well. After the review of its history, Daniel created a foundation in honor of everyone who contributed to its growth, including the people whose names had never appeared in public announcements. Emily never asked for recognition, but Daniel wanted the truth to be known. He wanted the company to represent the values they had both believed in when they started. Richard had also changed, although slowly. For the first time, he began to understand that family was not something controlled through reputation or tradition. It was something protected through trust. His relationship with Daniel was different now. They did not agree on everything, but there was honesty between them. That honesty had been missing for many years. One evening, Daniel and Emily returned to the small apartment building where they had lived when they first married. The neighborhood looked different, but the memories remained. They stood outside the building and remembered the days when they had almost nothing except their hopes and determination. Daniel looked at Emily and smiled. Do you remember when we thought this place was too small? Emily laughed softly. We thought we needed more space. Daniel nodded. But we were already building a home. Those words stayed with them, because they both understood something important. A home was never created by expensive furniture, a large house, or a successful name. A home was created by the people who chose each other every day. Years later, when people asked Daniel about his greatest achievement, he no longer talked about company growth, awards, or financial success. He talked about learning how to appreciate the person who believed in him before anyone else did. He talked about the importance of humility, gratitude, and recognizing the people who stand beside you when life is uncertain. Emily also looked back on their journey differently. She no longer remembered the painful moments as the end of their story. She saw them as the moment when both of them were forced to understand what truly mattered. The keys that once represented everything they had almost lost became a reminder of what they had learned. They were never just keys to a house. They represented trust, commitment, and the choice to build something together. And in the end, the greatest change was not the house, the company, or the life they created. It was the fact that Daniel and Emily finally saw each other clearly, not as symbols of success, not as expectations they had to fulfill, but as two people who chose, every day, to build a future together.